Well, welcome to our discussion on the new Dairy NRC 2001 and its updated information. If you want to learn more about management and dairy nutrition, please register for my course at the end of this presentation. Today's presentation will feature the new NRC Dairy 2021, what is new and what has changed. And the NRC is actually a book, and it's over 500 pages in length with a lot of discussion and references. It contains 22 different chapters. It has been reviewed by a committee to be sure that most of the information is solid. Officially, it is known as the NASEM Revised 8th Edition. And if some of you are wondering what does NASEM stand for, it is now known as the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. We also call it the Dairy NRC 2021, which I use. Some of the people refer to it as Dairy V or version 8 because it is the 8th edition of this booklet. And this booklet will be available in mid-December and can be ordered now. Another part of the effort was a new model. This will be a model that has all the equations that automatically make the adjustments based on the results in the booklet. So the good news, so some of you that have used the NRC 2001, it is in a very similar format and style. So if you ran that program, which I did, it's very easy to navigate. It also will be available in December of 2021, and we think it's going to be free. At least the beef version was allowed to go out free of charge. It will contain, of course, a critical aspect with all the amino acid guidelines, which is fairly technical, as you'll see here in just a minute. It also has a new chapter on environmental nutrient impact, looking at methane, nitrogen, phosphorus. More about that in a minute. A fatty acid evaluation, and of course, feed costs can be entered. So that if you make a change in a feed ingredient, you can see what impact that'll have on the cost of the diet. And that's a really nice addition. So let's look at the various sections. These were presented in late September or August and early September by people on the committee. So the first one is dry matter intake, abbreviated DMI, and that was presented by Dr. Mike Allen from Michigan State University. And here's some of the changes. They lowered the dry matter intake for high producing cows by approximately 2 kilograms. And that's not surprising because we could actually balance rations 1 kilogram lower than was in the old NRC. But they also increased it by 1 kilogram for low producing cows, which surprises me a little bit. Another interesting aspect is that there is a decrease in dry matter intake in early lactation or in the fresh cow pen, primarily because the rumen needs to distend or expand. And initially, back in 2001, that was 90 days. They shortened that down to 31 days, which means that these healthy, high-producing cows can eat more dry matter quicker in early lactation. Another factor is fat and protein does not impact dry matter intake, but fiber does. And the user has two options. They can either use the ratio of ADF to NDF or actual lignin to predict dry matter intake. That's a user option. And then a fill factor, which is a big factor. It says how much space do we have? They will be using Forage NDF and a term called Forage fragility. Fragility refers to the particle size reduction by the cow when she chews the feed and in the digestive tract. Unfortunately, there is no lab measurement for that. So my comments on dry matter intake, I think the adjustments in early lactation are excellent because basically dry matter costs money. And so even though it may be forage driven, that still will have some added cost. But the good news is if cows can eat more dry matter, that allows you to bring other low-cost ingredients into the feeding program, normally forages. The drag on fresh cows was reduced from 90 to 30 days, which is good news. And I think by using forage quality and fill factors, we can build a more balanced feeding program. Another chapter in the book was presented by Dr. Mark HANIGAN from Virginia Polytech, and that's on protein amino acids. Very technical discussion. New equations to predict milk protein using 5, not 2, not lysine, not methionine, but 5 amino acids and the other amino acids grouped together. And that was all done by using model predictions. So what they did is they put all different choices in and let the statistics determine when and if we are going to use those amino acids. So we now have a model predicting amino acid requirement. And if these values are incorrect, that would be your clue that you may want to add rumen-protected amino acids or a supplemental source of rumen undegraded protein. One concept that's been challenged a bit in the field, and that is that there's no first limiting amino acid anymore. And that was usually considered to be lysine and or methionine. And now it's just a group of amino acids, and you have to get them all correct. And the optimal level of rumen-degraded protein is 10% of the ration dry matter with a maximum of 12%. And if you get over 10%, you will probably see the milk urea nitrogen values increasing. So my comments is that it's a very challenging chapter to understand, to be honest. The protein amino acid model has been adjusted, but the focus was on milk protein yield. A great deal of mathematical modeling statistics were used to improve the models, and it's really a challenge to understand. The field applications, if you're going to use these amino acid balancing tools, you're going to have to use the model that comes out in December. And of course, if your milk market does not pay for milk protein, and that's true in the southeastern part of the United States, then the milk protein model probably has less economic value for you. Another important chapter was macrominerals, presented by Dr. Rich ERDMAN from the University of Maryland. And here are some of the small changes. The recommendations are based on absorbed mineral using an absorption coefficient. So it says how much of the calcium that you feed is actually going to be absorbed and into the bloodstream that can be utilized by the cow, by the mammary gland, by the liver, whatever target organ it's going to. Another interesting factor that the minimum dietary cation difference is based on requirements for sodium, potassium, chloride, and sulfur. So there is no impact for heat stress. More about that in just a minute. Magnesium, the AC, which stands, as you saw above, absorption coefficient, adjusted the magnesium-potassium equation, a reduction in milk manganese requirements, and an increase in maintenance. So the changes are going to be small. Sodium maintenance was increased by 10 to 15 grams per day, but dropped in the lactation requirement by 6 to 12 grams. So it's pretty much each of canceling them out. As far as the macro minerals, there really weren't many major changes. Sulfur was not changed, for example. Potassium was not changed greatly. There was no recommendation under heat stress for DCAD. Sodium and potassium were not included. They are in the discussion. And the reason they're not included because it has to do with requirement and not under a specific situation. So I think some nutritionists and dairy farmers are going to really want to monitor the macromineral levels based on total amounts instead of the absorbed level. Both of those values will be presented in the rumen model. Dr. Bill Weiss from The Ohio State University presented an overview on trace minerals, and there are some changes here. One which surprised myself and perhaps some in the room or online, no adjustments were made for dietary antagonists. For example, molybdenum can tie up calcium, and we know there are other antagonisms there as well. Iron and sulfur can tie up some of the trace minerals, for example. Second of all, there is no safety factors included in the recommendation. The recommendations are based for a cow at 3.5% of body weight, probably producing around 30 liters of milk, and that's the level that is being recommended. Well pointed out, an important factor is dry cows consume about half the dry matter compared to lactating cows. But these cows have about the same milligrams needed per day. So while the concentration in dry cows go up significantly, it's about the same milligrams per cow per day. And interestingly, there is no AC adjustments for organic trace minerals even though the research would suggest they are more biologically available. Let's look at these quickly from Dr. Weiss. Cobalt increased from 0.1 to 0.2 parts per million. Copper levels were suggested to be 17 parts per million for dry cows, 8 for lactating cows. Remember, the difference in dry matter intake becomes a big factor here. No adjustments were suggested for jerseys, although it is written up in the booklet. Surprising to me, there are no chromium guidelines or requirements or recommendations, and that is because they suggested there wasn't enough data yet. Manganese up to 40 parts per million for dry cows and 30 parts per million for milk cows should be adequate. Selenium, there are no changes in the selenium, either as organic or inorganic sources, and of course that is regulated by FDA. Zinc, dry cows was raised 10% to approximately 28 parts per million. Lactating cows was increased 15% to 60 parts per million. And of course, be well aware of the dry matter factor as well. So my comments would be that there were such significant changes made in the report. Disappointing to me that there was no adjustments for antagonists, because the antagonists could be put into the model. If they're excess moly, excess sulfur in water, for example, iron in feedstuffs, but should be considered by nutritionists. So you'll still have a job as nutritionists. No guidelines for chromium, but supplemental amounts was acknowledged can impact milk production and improve health. And to my dismay, because I like them, there is no mineral ratios were listed, at least in the report. They might be in the book. Again, Dr. Bill Weiss from Ohio State, The Ohio State University, also covered vitamins. He is one of the more applied nutritionists that are on the committee. And really, there wasn't much of a change for cows unless they're producing more than 75 pounds of milk, which would be about 32, 33 liters of milk. And when they produce higher levels of milk above that, they increase the vitamin A requirement by 450 international units. That's what IU stands for, international units, for each pound of milk produced above the 75 pounds. Not a big surprise. Vitamin D has half the biological value as vitamin D. Vitamin D2 has half the biological value of vitamin D3. An interesting side point that will be explained more in the book, and that they didn't make the comment about maintaining plasma concentrations of vitamin D25 hydroxy. This is a form of vitamin D, and they were listing that they would like to see this in the bloodstream at 30 nanograms per milliliter. So they think this is a biologically active form of vitamin D and should be monitored. So we'll be hearing more about this, assuming our testing labs can test that in the bloodstream. They did up the vitamin E levels for the far-off dry cow to 1,000 units of far-off dry cows and 2,000 international units for the close-up dry cow. And for some of us, we'll probably accelerate that level even a little bit quicker in the far-off dry cow program. So my comments, there were significant changes reported. Disappointing to me, there were no guidelines for niacin, choline, or biotin were listed because the higher levels are not a requirement. And so there should be supplemental amounts coming from the rumen microbes or from the normal feedstuffs themselves. So this lets a lot of this both in the macro and micro and vitamin levels to the dairy farmer, the veterinarian, and nutritionists to determine, well, what are you going to do with organic trace minerals? Chromium guidelines, are you going to increase chromium supplementation? And what about rumen protected choline, for example? What are you going to add here as well? Now, if you have a specific value for an organic trace mineral, then you can go in the model and change the AC value to reflect its higher availability. There's some suggestion, for example, organic selenium from microbial sources or from yeast sources is about 60% more biologically available than inorganic selenium. And as a user of the model, you can go in and make that change. Again, you might say this is the Bill Weiss show, but Bill also discussed transition cows. And here are some significant changes. The dry matter level will be adjusted based on NDF levels in the dye. And that really makes good sense. And the Goldilocks or the high high straw diets will fit very well with the model in its prediction. And that range will go from 1.8 to 2% of the cow's body weight. Heifers, springing heifers, coming in the first time, they're going to reduce the dry matter by 88% of mature cows. The dry matter will start dropping 2 weeks before calving or prepartum, and gradually drop down to 1.6% of body weight. That represents about a 10% drop in body weight. And that is basically happening sometimes on the low energy dense rations. That isn't quite to that degree as well. The birth weight of the unborn calf is estimated based on the parity, in other words, first, second, third lactation cows, and the cow's body weight. Some other things that happen here is that protein and energy requirements for the unborn calf begins 10 days basically after conception. No adjustments are included for twins, but we know twins, if you have two fetuses, they will remove a lot higher nutrient demand as well. And so if those are diagnosed, very common in the U.S., 6 to 8% mature cows will carry twins. The protein levels are at 12% crude protein for far-off dry cows, or that'd be 7.2% metabolizable protein, abbreviated MP. 13% crude protein, or 8.6% metabolizable protein for the close-up dry cows, and for the springing heifers, a 14% crude protein at 9.2% metabolizable protein. So certainly they are reflecting that as animals become later in gestation, we are increasing protein levels. There's no adjustments for colostrum synthesis. They are listed in the booklet. I do not have the book, so I cannot see what they are. But obviously that is going to increase the protein requirement because colostrum is rich, 5 times higher in protein content and rich in antibody levels as well. And of course, there was no adjustments for rumen protectant methionine, even though there is a lot of data from the University of Wisconsin, the University of Illinois, showing that it has other benefits besides just an amino acid requirement. So my comments already pretty much made. I think improvements, certainly separating dry matter intake on farms that do have pens of dry cows and springing heifers will be a real plus. The protein recommendations are lower than what we see in the field. They're going to be looking somewhere about 1,000 grams of metabolizable protein, and a lot of the people in the field are up around 1,200. So again, there's some opportunities to do some flexibility, especially in close-up rations when colostrum synthesis and fetal draws are quite a bit higher. Colostrum requirements are significant. So I think you can reflect that in your close-up rations. And certainly, as we look at increasing dietary protein in the close-up ration, we also may want to make some energy changes. And what's common in the field is dropping the NDF levels down and replacing that with sugars or starches just to build in more microbial function into the feeding program. Another area that was discussed in other chapters, fats and oils or lipids, and that was done by Dr. Lou Armentano from the University of Wisconsin. Ether extract is out. We're not going to use that term anymore. We're going to use fatty acids. So that's one change there. The lipids that are commercially available on most farms around the world were grouped into 11 categories, and each of those would have unique digestibility. Some of those will be some of the rumen protected problems. Some of them are going to be oil seeds. Some are going to be animal sources. And of course, you can change those values as far as digestibility goes. The basal oils, such as like from corn silage, fuzzy cottonseed, soybeans, corn grains, would have an digestibility of 73%. Again, if you are processing those, such as high moisture corn or rehydrated corn or finely processed corn, you could increase that number up or down depending on your farm situation as well. Fats do not generate methane. In fact, they will inhibit methane generation, and that is being taken into consideration in the model, and will lower methane production from some of the other sources, such as forages. And another important change is no depression of dry matter intake due to fat feeding in early lactation. And of course, the powerful data basically came from Michigan State University through Dr. Adam Locke. So my comments, lots of good things happened. First of all, we've moved to fatty acids in the model, and the model is going to calculate the grams of the various fatty acids, including the PUFAs. So now if you get over 400 to 500 grams of PUFA, you can see where they're coming from and how you can lower them down. And certainly the Michigan State data would indicate that there is a balance in fatty acids. Not lowering dry matter intake in fresh cows is a plus because it allows us to try to get more energy into early lactation cows when it's really needed. And of course, environmentally, the fats will lower methane production, which will be a plus in terms of consumers. Then let's take a quick look at carbohydrates. Dr. Mary Beth Hall from the USDA Forage Research Center presented this data. And there are some new terms that we're going to have to learn as nutritionists. Residual organic matter, abbreviated ROM, and starch replaces NFC, which is non-fiber carbohydrate. That's a really good move. Starch is now separated out as a unique carbohydrate class, and that's a good move because it allows us to really fine-tune rations and know exactly where this is coming from rather than using NFC. The group also recommended using the 48-hour NDF digestibility, or DNDF, is recommended for in vitro times to enter into the model. And of course, how is the ROM, or residual organic matter, calculated? Well, it's by difference. So it says you from 100, you subtract a crude protein, ash or mineral, fatty acids, starch, water-soluble carbohydrates, defined in the next PowerPoint, and NDF soluble fiber, organic acids, and glycerol. So that's the only really weakness, is that the ROM is calculated rather than actually experimentally designed as a unique nutrient. Water-soluble carbohydrates, some of you may wonder what is that? It is sugar, oligosaccharides, and fructans. What about that other term, NDFSF? Neutral detergent soluble fiber. And that is pectins and beta glucans. Both of these, of course, going to be sources of energy for rumen microbes. No starch processing effects were included, but you can enter and change that value in the program as far as starch digestibility. And they're defining physically effective NDF using the 8mm Penn State particle size box. I think that surprises some of us online. We thought they'd be using the 1.8mm or the 4mm, but again, they're models. They look at all the different ways of evaluating, and that was the most accurate way to estimate physically effective fiber. Personally, I really agree with that. And rumination time, if you have rumination detection devices on your cows. This is a pretty unique table that was I could copy down quickly during the presentation, as Mary Beth Hall allowed it up for a period of time. And that's an important concept. So if you look at forage NDF, that is going to be your physical fiber fraction. Then you've got a minimal chemical fiber, NDF, and then the maximum amount of starch. And this table clearly shows that if you feed less forage NDF, you need to lower the starch level because it's going to challenge the rumen dynamics. Also, if you are going to go to lower levels of forage NDF, you probably need to raise the minimum NDF up by using byproduct feeds, such as soy hulls, corn gluten feed would be examples. Citrus pulp would be another one. So it shows to the nutritionist, the dairy farmer, the veterinarian, that these relationships are very important. And of course, if you are going to cheat on one of these numbers, you have to make a compromise or adjustment on the other one. Very powerful table. Okay, what about some of these modifiers then? And she went through these as forage NDF, because the range you have to in diets all the way from 15 to 25%. That's the normal forage NDF levels found in most rations. Most people target 20 to 21. So if you are going to feed shorter particle sizes, you better be closer to 25. You have to raise the forage NDF. If you have high dry matter intakes, cows eating lots of feed, you can actually lower the forage NDF as long as you meet the total NDF requirements. If you add a buffer, you can also lower the forage NDF. Depending on the type of starch, You'll have to raise that, especially if it's wheat driven, which you find in Europe, or extremely finely particle sized ground corn. Then again, you need to protect the rumen by raising forage NDF. If the grain is fed separately or cows tend to slug feed TMRs, you need again to protect the rumen by raising forage NDF. And if you have limited bunk space and overcrowding in the facility, again, you got to raise the forage NDF to protect against slug feeding and engorgement of the feed. So my comments, wow, good news. Splitting the starch out as a carbohydrate allows us to really zero in on that. And also remember, you can change the digestibility of that starch. The relationship between starch, total NDF, and forage NDF will be very useful in the field, how those balance against each other. Physically effective fiber is useful, and you'll have to fit that into your field observation. That's an important concept, but it's having a difficulty to actually analyze that. Dr. Rick Grant has done a nice job on that, and he discussed that in some of our classes. And of course, ROM, residual organic matter, is a much better term in my view than NFC because it breaks out some of the carbohydrate fractions. Another area was energy supply. Again, Dr. Bill Weiss, Ohio State, covered that. Big things happened here. The discount of energy, in other words, as animals eat more energy, more dry matter, is going to be based on percent of body weight instead of multiples of maintenance. And that baseline is going to be 3.5% of the cow's body weight. So it certainly allows the cows to make that adjustment. And then the second bullet point, the actual discount factor has been lowered. And that's really good news because it means high producing cows now can eat more dry matter and will not be discounted at the higher levels at this point. Obviously, we have cows getting 60 kilograms of milk, and they eat a lot of dry matter. We already mentioned that starch is separated out from ROM and has been dropped for NFC. And the starch digestibility has been set at 91% or 0.91. And again, you can go in and modify that depending if it's wheat or barley or corn, or depending on its processing effect. Lots of flexibility brought in on the energy supply part of the discussion. The summative equation was also modified to reflect the starch and the ROM values, and then subtract out modified fecal energy. Methane production was estimated coming from digestible NDF and, of course, from the lipid fractions we talked about a bit earlier. And, of course, generally, you'll see a bit later, methane can account for nearly 5.7% of the intake energy in a dairy ration. And then they also fine-tuned the urinary nitrogen excretion. We know it takes energy to excrete the nitrogen. And so they actually calculate that. And again, if you have excess nitrogen in the diet, then you are having another tax, you might say, on the energy supply. So from my perspective, I thought the energy supply discussion was excellent. The changes in discount, how it's calculated, and the level of it is important, and the amount of discount applied for high-producing cows, and certainly the fine-tuning of the methane losses and nitrogen energy discounts will be useful as well. Energy requirement by Dr. Mike Vanderhart. He is from Michigan State University, and this is big. The first one is the increased maintenance requirements by 25. And it's really big for dry cows because dry cows, basically, most of their requirements based on maintenance. They aren't producing milk at this point. So that's going to be an important change as far as that goes. And they probably would say in the next edition, assuming it comes out again, in another 8 or 10 years, that number will go up again because our cows are different. Our cows have different maintenance requirements based on their size and other factors. Certainly, weight changes in cows will reflect compositional changes. So in other words, if it's a frame growth, for example, in a young cow, we'll have a higher protein requirement. If it's body condition score, for example, in late lactation cows, that's going to be more of an energy requirement listed there. Disappointing to me, the heat stress impacts were dropped. More about that in just a minute. Higher starch levels will reduce digestible NDF. So there is a starch tax, if you wish, and that'll be important as well. And then a short discussion by Dr. Vanderhaar about genetic efficiencies of cows in the future. And yet they could not put that in the model, but that's coming, and it's coming quickly. So my comments on energy supply, certainly the changes in body composition reflecting protein energy requirements will be useful. Certainly the change of maintenance is important because we have new data, and that will impact dry cows more than lactating cows. And I was disappointed and expressed that to the committee online that dropping the increase in maintenance charge, which is roughly 11%, higher maintenance charge under heat stress, and lower dry matter intakes can be as much as 2 or 3 kilograms a day. That could be very easily modeled, and it was in the old NRC, and they just dropped it out. And I think it's going to be important as we see more global warming occurring in the world. Dr. Jim Drakely from our University of Illinois did a nice job doing the calf nutrition section or chapter. A lot of important news here, although I think the differences are going to be modest. Requirements were completely changed based on dairy calf slaughter results and in the equation there. Previously, a lot of this was based on beef cattle. A new equation for protein deposition related to weight gain. So if cattle are gaining more, growing more aggressively in the calf area, then the protein requirements will go up. A nice improvement. They broke it into subtropical and moderate environments in terms of requirements, and the cutoff point is 35 degrees Celsius. So that's about 90 plus degrees Fahrenheit. And so if calves are under cold stress or heat stress, they will reflect in their requirement to meet their needs. Calcium levels were lowered. These are primarily in milk replacer animals. The calcium levels were lowered. Phosphorus was also lowered 15%. Potassium raised to mimic cow's milk. Copper dropped 50%. Iron dropped 15%. And zinc was raised 40%. So those, based on the research that they had available to them, they really made some changes primarily in milk replacers. This will also become a player if some of you feed what we call milk balancers. This is a powder that sometimes contains probiotics, prebiotics, iron, extra vitamin E, for example, to make whole milk even more nutritious. And they then recommend, which I thought was excellent, 1.5% of the calf's body weight as milk or milk solids. Our number was 2% of birth weight. Theirs is 1.5% of the calf's weight. And the reason we both have these numbers is try to encourage calf starter consumption. A, it's cheaper, and B, it develops the rumen. A nice table here that's a bit busy, but hopefully you can print it off if you wish. You can see over on the left side of the table, this is the average daily gain, abbreviated sometimes ADG, and you can see calves gaining 600 grams a day to calves gaining 1,000 grams per day, and that's the goal. 1,000 grams is what our young calves should be gaining. You can see to get that gain, they have to eat more dry matter, and that means more milk solids. The energy, you can see, increases slightly at this point, but the protein really jumps up. The protein really jumps up. This is grams of crude protein. And then the final column on the right, which is important to look at if you're buying a milk replacer, you can see that if you're going to go for this more aggressive gain, you're going to be buying about a milk replacer that contains 26% crude protein compared to, say, a 20% crude protein product. So again, pick your strategy on your dairy farm. If you're going to double calf's body weight in the first 50 days, and that is the goal, then you've got to be down on the bottom line. So the bottom line says you will feed a much more nutritious milk product to the calves, and they will grow faster. So my comments on calves, just excellent improvements were made, reflecting the new calf data instead of beef data, environmental effects, nutrient concentrations goes into calves. The higher dry matter solids intake is important for economic growth. Yes, milk replacer milk costs more money, but if you look at cost per gram of gain or kilogram of gain, they are so efficient that you actually make money doing that as far as that goes, while developing the rumen. Mike Van Haar returned again to discuss growing heifers. They are going to be using metabolizable energy instead of TDN or net energy, and this is going to again be based on dairy heifer data. The Holstein breed is the reference breed, but in the model, if you put in the appropriate weight for a Jersey or crossbred animal, then those requirements will reflect that. So he's comfortable that by specifying body weight, you have some other breeds there. Again, I'm disappointed there are no environmental factors were included. And here in the northern part of the United States, we have winter. And so no effects in terms of hair coat, mud, wetness, wind velocity, temperature, and they were in the old NRC, in fact, in the model itself. Again, for calculations, body condition score is assumed to be 3-0 before you start adding or subtracting nutrients. And the last comment, and there's a write-up in the book, which I have not seen yet, but weight gains over 1.1 kilogram, which would be about 2.3 pounds per day, will have potential negative effects in the pre-pubic heifer from 3 to 8 months of age. So my comments is going to an ME energy base will remove the question about net energy gain, net energy maintenance, and TDN. Using dairy heifer data was a plus in determining requirements here. And as you already know, I'm disappointed on environmental because we did that a lot for teaching. Great teaching showing that if heifers are outside with a 0 degree Fahrenheit with a 10-mile-an-hour wind and the short hair coat or muddy or wet, how much more energy was required. So we are now done. We walked you through the most significant chapters. If you sign up for the course, we are planning to do an update on every one of the chapters. So it means sometime in 2022, we should have 22 additional updates on the written material along with the experience of running the model at this point. Anyway, my take-home messages include that certainly these changes in the equations in the model will reflect high-producing cows, and that's using the most recent research we have. Certainly a great deal of flexibility. You can change the values in the model for such things as fat digestibility, starch digestibility, those kind of factors. So you can actually customize the ration if you wish using that model there. And just be well aware that a lot of the guidelines, in my view, were conservative. And that was also shared by several of my colleagues here using only multiple journal research published information, which took out some of the stuff on organic trace minerals, some of the stuff on chromium, and some of the other factors as well. So that completes our discussion here. And then I'm going to wrap up with a short discussion here about my class. So you now heard the NRC discussion. It was fairly fast. We hit the highlights. There's going to be a lot more coming in 2022 as far as that goes. You can now register for the year-long class at the listed link below that you can see on the screen. By enrolling in this class, you'll have access to over 80 training modules that include dry cows, milk cows, heifers, calves, immunity, culling, fertility, all those things, along with case studies of on-farm situations to test what would you do if this was a farm that you were visiting. There's also graded quizzes that you can test your knowledge. Do you really understand some of the basics in each of these modules? And then once a month, you will have an opportunity to ask me questions directly. I will be available online for an hour, and you can ask questions or get clarification. So if you register now, you may also get a discount. Well, thanks for attending today. Have a great day.